Good day, my name is Raheem Oluwafunminiyi. The title of my presentation is Luther versus Us, Encountering the Reformation Through the Eyes of an African Class. Basically, the presentation looks at some of the arguments raised amongst about 95 students in the class 10 years ago on the Reformation. So we'll be looking at some of these arguments within the context of this presentation. We have the introduction, we have the making of that class, because I'll be basically describing how that class emerged. Also, the presentation will be looking at some of the contentious issues raised in that class. We'll also be looking at how the Reformation led to the establishment of African independent churches in the early part of the 20th century, and of course the conclusion of the presentation. Now, in 1517, Martin Luther wrote what we call the 95 Theses. It was basically to challenge the sales of indulgences by the Catholic Church. He also had series of arguments that deals with belief, salvation, to mention a few. However, the class basically criticized some of Martin Luther's views about the Catholic Church, while some members of the class also were in support of series of the arguments raised by Martin Luther. So these are the arguments we basically want to argue within the context of this presentation. In 1517, Martin Luther wrote 95 Theses. It was basically a thesis that challenged the sales or the commercialization of indulgences by the Catholic Church at this time. However, his intention was basically to dispute against these doctrines and not to cause a rift or a division between him and the Catholic Church. Hence, his actions quickly snowballed into what we call the Protestant Reformation today. The making of a Reformation class basically talks about how about 95 students offered the course European History, where the Reformation was discussed. In the discussion, series of arguments came up, which of course I have termed the contentious issues. Among series of the issues that were raised in the class, 3 are germane to this presentation. One is that we were looking at how the Reformation emerged in 1517, because there are a series of arguments that claim that the Reformation did not happen in 1517, basically, that it had happened for as far as the 11th century. We also looked at how the Black Death also led to the weakening of the Catholic Church at this time, and of course we also look at the Papal Schism that brought about the rise of 3 popes in Europe at this time. The argument was basically that these events, amongst others, were responsible for the weakening of the church that led to what? The Reformation in 1517, led by Martin Luther. The another contentious issue was basically whether the Reformation was a revolt, a reformation, a revolution, or a restoration. Now, part of the class believed that the 1517 event was a reformation, using the 95 Theses as a typical example. The 95 Theses aimed at reforming some of the doctrines and some of the dogmas of the church, especially within the context of the sales of indulgences. One other section of the class believed that Martin Luther's action was a revolt against the church, using series of examples. Our class instructor believed that the 1517 event was a restoration and of course a revolution, using series of examples, cited series of examples. For example, she claimed that the church had always been a very powerful institution. She believed that the church from the 11th century had unified Europe, and everybody in Europe at this time looked up to the church for solutions to all kinds of problems. So the church was basically seen as an infallible institution that could not do any wrong. So by the time Martin Luther came up with his thesis in 1517, he broke up that power that the church had wielded for centuries. So for her, it was basically what? a revolution, against the Catholic Church. Now, the last contentious issues was basically whether Martin Luther was a Protestant or a hypocrite. Now, for those of us in the class who believe that Martin Luther was a Protestant, hinged the argument on Martin Luther's belief that mankind must look towards the Bible for salvation rather than the Pope for salvation. So for him, for this class, they believe that Martin Luther was sincere in his arguments against the church. While those people who believe that Martin Luther was a hypocrite hinge the argument of some of the books Martin Luther had written at this time. For example, Martin Luther had written a book that praised the Jews. He argued that the Catholic Church should embrace the Jews, despite some of the arguments, some of the arguments against them. A few years after, Martin Luther came up with another book that chastised the Jews and claimed that the Jews were not fit enough to live in Europe and that they should be persecuted or executed wherever they are founded. So this group who believed that Martin Luther was a hypocrite hinged their argument on these events. Now, on the issue of how the Reformation links with the rise of African independent churches in Africa. From the 1850s, the Church Missionary Society, under the auspices of the Anglican Church of Britain, began to Christianize Africans. Of course, they came to Africa alongside the Methodists, amongst other Protestant movements, had come to Africa to Christianize the people. But to make a success of their mission, they had to incorporate Africans into their fold. Now, these Africans were trained in Bible reading. They were also educated along Western lines. But these Africans also had attainments. They wanted to become beyond being clerical officers or assistant bishops. They also wanted to become bishops. They also wanted to preside over large churches. But this could not be attained because of the European churches. The leaders in the European churches did not believe that Africans could attain such heights. So it was because of this reason, amongst other reasons, that these Africans eventually led a schism against mainline historic churches by moving away from these churches to set up what we call the African independent churches. Their belief was that Africans should also worship God in the African way, the same way Europeans worship God in the European way. So from the early part of the 20th century, we had series of African independent churches scattered across sub-Saharan Africa who worshipped God in their own ways. They came up with series of doctrines that were indigenous to the people, series of dogmas that were indigenous to the people. So this is how basically the Reformation links with the rise of African independent churches in Africa in the early part of the 20th century. Basically, the presentation looks at how students about 10 years ago viewed religious differences in Europe in the 16th century. The Reformation will be 500 years, and it resonates across the world today. The effect of the Reformation resonates across the world today. Many across the world are either Catholics or, of course, follow one Protestant movement or the other. This is because of Martin Luther's actions in 1517. Personally, in my own view, I believe that Martin Luther's actions in 1517 was necessary owing to the fact that the church had gone astray for centuries, that had for years refused to reform itself. His actions basically promoted religious justice and religious tolerance, not only in Europe, but of course across the world. My name is Raheem Oluwafunminiyi. Thank you for listening.
Simon.
Hello, Raheem.
Good afternoon.
Hi, can you hear me?
Good afternoon. I can.
Excellent. We can hear you too.
All right.
We just watched your presentation, which I personally really enjoyed. I'm going to ask the people here now if they have any questions. Anyone have any questions for Raheem? Yep, there's one at the back. This is Suzanne from the Open University.
Okay.
Hello, I found your presentation really interesting. I wonder how common was that class where you discussed the European Reformation? How many Africans know much about the history of Christianity in Europe?
Not much really. Not much really. Here in Nigeria, most especially, we get to learn about the European Reformation and Christianity in Europe generally in our history courses at the departmental level. So it's not really common for most students in Africa, especially here in Nigeria, to know about how Christianity arose in Europe from the earliest times to the time of the Reformation.
Okay, anybody else? Any other questions? We have two. I'll come to you next, Ariel.
All right.
Hi Raheem, it's John Purdy. I'm a civilian, not an academic. My question is, have you been able to do any follow-up on the class of 10 years ago as to how their opinions have changed over the years at all?
No, actually, I was able to speak with some of my colleagues who were in that class, two of them basically, to gauge their understanding of the Reformation several years after. And of course, their position has never changed. But did not change from what it was 10 years ago. The belief was that the Catholic Church was so powerful that it needed to change at some point in time, which it didn't change, not until Martin Luther's emergence in 1517. So majority of us in that class still believe 10 years after that the Reformation should eventually have happened, at some point in time. If it was not Luther, someone else too would have come up at some point in time, to challenge the church. So that's basically it.
Hello, Raheem. Thank you. I found that very interesting as well. It was interesting that you said that several people in the class thought that Luther was a hypocrite. I was wondering what source material the class looked at to reach their conclusions as to whether he was I mean, you said obviously about your teacher, but beyond the teacher, were you given some of Luther's works to read? Were you given the works of historians? What was it that helped form people's opinions as to whether Luther was a Protestant or a hypocrite?
Yeah, it basically on some of Luther's positions in some of the literature, some of the books, some of the works he wrote, most especially the one he wrote on, he wrote about the Jews, which I have in the paper, titled that Jesus Christ was born a Jew, published in 1523. So that was the book that was used to argue that Luther was basically a hypocrite, because in 1543, he also wrote a similar book titled On the Jews and Their Lies, which is in contrast with the one he wrote in 1523. So those books basically, and aside that too, till end of Luther's life, he began to engage in acts that people believed was not normal, if you allow me to use that word, which was not in tandem with how he initially began his protest against the Catholic Church. So these are some of the arguments, the books that were used to argue within the context of Luther's hypocrisy, so to speak.
Any other questions for Raheem? Yes, I have one.
All right.
Hello, Raheem. I happen to have stumbled into this conference from Ghana, and
wow, wonderful.
which is not very far from where you are. Now, I'm thinking about Luther's influence and
Yes.
changes that he brought to evangelism. And I'm looking at what has happened in Africa in the 20th century. I think you agree with me that there's a revolution going on, but the sort of revolution that is going on in West Africa, Ghana and Nigeria in particular, means that the people who are now spearheading evangelism in Ghana and Nigeria are probably becoming more and more powerful than the Catholic Church. What do you think is going to happen in 10 or 15 years' time with new African churches as we see them in West Africa now?
Thank you very much. I think I will agree with you. As far as I'm concerned today, the African churches are quite powerful, even more powerful than the states. And the states sometimes, for example, in Nigeria here, you cannot campaign or you cannot win an election without the influence of religious leaders. And certain policies if you want to enact certain policies in Nigeria, for example, also, you have to consider the church before engaging in before enacting those policies. So I see the church as being highly influential, highly powerful, and a domineering factor within the context of our politics here in Nigeria.
Can I give you a follow-on question then?
Please.
Does this not contradict everything that Luther is about? Because what we have in Africa now is a situation where people are relying on church leaders, some of whom are more powerful than their political leaders, for solution to all their problems. And most of the people in Ghana and Nigeria in particular have moved away from a certain realization that there is a direct line between them as Christians and the God they serve. That is a contradiction to what Luther was about, isn't it?
Yes, I think I agree with you. Basically, I agree with you. It's in contradiction. But if you look at it from the angle of for the fact that Christians and of course Muslims in this case too can pursue their faith without fear or favor. If you look at it from that angle, we can still give credit to Luther on that. We can still give Luther credit on that. What he basically did was to enjoin Christians in Europe to worship God based on their convictions. So in Africa and of course in Nigeria in Nigeria and Ghana, I think irrespective of how powerful these churches are today and will be in the future, I don't think it's not going to relegate anybody's what's that English I want to use? It's not going to disturb anybody from practicing their faith, really. So that's what I believe.
Any other questions for Raheem? Raheem, I'm so glad we were able to connect. Thank you very much indeed.
Yeah, you're welcome. I'm really watching.